It was supposed to be a celebration. 30 years ago, humanity sent a probe farther than we'd ever dared before. It was a long shot, a mission designed to explore the edges of our solar system and beyond, to venture into the unknown. We'd packed it with instruments, cameras, and data collectors, all carefully programmed to send back what it found. Most of us never thought we'd hear from it again. But we did. A week ago, the probe sent back a signal. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by cosmic noise, but unmistakable. After 30 years of silence, it had come home. The scientists couldn't contain their excitement. They said it was carrying something. Data, maybe samples. Whatever it was enough to light up the scientific community like a flare in the night. They rushed to recover it, brought it down to a secure facility in the middle of nowhere. And that's where we came in. I wasn't a scientist, just part of the logistics team, there to make sure the people who mattered had what they needed. If I'd known what was coming, I would have walked away right then. When we first saw the probe, it looked wrong. The years had been hard on it. The hull was scorched, dented, and streaked with what looked like burn marks. But that wasn't what bothered me. There was something about the way it sat in the hangar, under the harsh fluorescent lights, that made my skin crawl. It felt off, like it didn't belong anymore. One of the techs joked that it looked haunted. Nobody laughed. They started the analysis almost immediately, swarming the probe with scanners and tools. I tried to stay out of the way, but curiosity got the better of me. I wandered closer, watching as they opened the main hatch. The air seemed to change when they did it, heavier, colder, like the room itself was holding its breath. A few of the scientists exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't say anything. The probe was full of strange material. Some of it looked like dust, but it shimmered faintly under the light, like it was alive. They collected it carefully, sealing it in containers and muttering about unprecedented discoveries. I stayed behind as the team moved deeper into the analysis. The hangar felt quieter now, almost too quiet, like the air itself was retreating. That's when I noticed the sound. At first I thought it was the hum of the equipment, but it wasn't. It was softer, almost rhythmic, like a pulse. It was faint, so faint that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, almost. I looked around, but nobody else seemed to hear it. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. It didn't feel like the kind of thing you could explain. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The pulse stayed with me, echoing in the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't fear, not yet, but something close, like standing on the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of the void. The next day, things got stranger. Some of the scientists were complaining about headaches, strange dreams. One of them swore she heard a voice when she was working with the samples, but nobody believed her. I wanted to, though. I hadn't heard a voice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The pulse was stronger now, or maybe I was just more attuned to it. Either way, it was impossible to ignore. And then the lights in the hangar flickered. Just once, but it was enough to stop everyone in their tracks. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Someone laughed nervously, said it was just a power surge. But when the lights came back on, we all saw it. The dust, the shimmering material from the probe, was moving. It was subtle, like it was breathing, but it was there. One of the scientists reached out to touch it, and I wanted to yell at him to stop, but the words caught in my throat. His hand hovered just above the surface, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the dust surged upward, wrapping around his fingers like smoke. He screamed. We scrambled back instinctively, some of us tripping over the cables and equipment scattered across the floor. The scientist was still screaming, clawing at his hand as the dust twisted around it. It wasn't just clinging to him. It was burrowing. You could see it disappearing under his skin, tiny tendrils spreading like cracks in glass. His screams turned guttural, desperate, the kind of sound that makes your stomach churn because you know it's not human. Nobody moved to help him at first. It was like we were frozen, caught between disbelief and terror. One of the techs finally snapped out of it and ran to grab him, but before he could reach him, the scientist collapsed. His body hit the floor hard, and the silence that followed was deafening. We just stood there staring, too afraid to get any closer. The dust, or whatever it was, had stopped moving. It hovered in the air for a moment, shimmering faintly, before settling back into the container. The tech who had tried to help backed away, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he'd just seen. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, but nobody answered. One of the senior scientists finally snapped out of it and ordered everyone out of the hangar. We left in a hurry, glancing over our shoulders like we expected the dust to follow us. They locked the hangar down after that, sealing it off with heavy steel doors and quarantine protocols. They told us it was for our safety, that they needed time to analyze what had happened. But we all knew the truth. They had no idea what they were dealing with. None of us did. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the dust moved, the way it seemed alive. It wasn't just a reaction to his touch. It was deliberate, intentional, like it had been waiting for him. I tried to tell myself it was just some kind of chemical reaction, something we didn't understand yet. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I could feel it, like a splinter in my mind. The next few days were a blur. The team split into smaller groups, some working around the clock to analyze the data, others focusing on the samples. I stayed on the logistics side, doing my best to keep my head down. But the tension was impossible to ignore. People were on edge, snapping at each other over nothing. The headaches were getting worse too. Some of the scientists started complaining about strange sensations like they were being watched. I wanted to tell them I felt it too, but I didn't. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. Then the first person disappeared. It was subtle at first, just an absence. One of the lab techs didn't show up for his shift. Nobody thought much of it at the time. We figured he was taking a break or maybe sleeping off the stress. But by the end of the day, when nobody could reach him, people started to worry. They checked his quarters, the break rooms, even the bathrooms. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished. The official line was that he'd left the facility. Maybe he'd cracked under the pressure and walked out into the desert. But that didn't make sense. The facility was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. There was nowhere to go. And then there was his workstation. When they checked the security footage, the cameras had gone black for about 15 minutes right before he disappeared. Nobody could explain it. By the third day, the disappearances had become a pattern. 2 more people were gone, both vanishing under the same circumstances. Blacked out cameras, no witnesses, no signs of struggle. The only common thread was that they'd all been working near the probe. The rest of us started avoiding the hangar entirely. Even the senior scientists were steering clear, focusing their efforts on remote analysis and staying locked in their labs. But that didn't help. The headaches got worse, turning into migraines that left people incapacitated. And then there were the dreams. I didn't want to admit it at first, but I was having them too. They were fragmented, disjointed, flashes of dark shapes and unfamiliar stars, of something vast and unknowable, stretching out into infinity. I would wake up drenched in sweat. The images burned into my mind. I wasn't the only one. People started whispering about it in the hallways, trading fragments of their dreams like pieces of a puzzle. The worst part was how similar they were. It didn't matter who you talked to, the details were always the same. The same shapes, the same stars, the same sense of being watched by something other. I don't know when it started, but at some point, the pulse came back. Louder this time, almost deafening. It was everywhere, in the walls, the floors, the very air. You couldn't escape it. And the dust? It wasn't confined to the hangar anymore. The dust began appearing in places it shouldn't have been. At first, it was just small traces, a faint shimmer on a desk, a speck caught in the corner of someone's eye. But it didn't stay that way. By the end of the week, entire sections of the facility were contaminated. It clung to the walls and ceilings, collecting in corners like cobwebs. The cleaning crews tried to contain it, scrubbing and sealing off affected areas, but it didn't matter. The dust always came back. The thing was, it wasn't just dust anymore. It was changing. People started reporting strange behaviors, objects shifting slightly when no one was looking, shadows that seemed to move against the light. It was subtle at first, easy to write off as stress or paranoia. But as the days dragged on, it became harder to ignore. I saw it myself one night. I was in the break room, staring blankly at a cup of coffee I wasn't drinking, when I noticed the shadow of the chair across from me. It twitched, just for a second, like something had passed behind it. But the room was empty. Nobody wanted to talk about it directly, but you could see it in their faces. The fear, the uncertainty. We all knew something was wrong, but saying it out loud made it real, and none of us were ready for that. Not yet. The facility felt different now, like it was alive. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. The hum of the machinery, once a comforting constant, now sounded discordant, almost menacing. And the pulse. It was everywhere, not just a sound, but a feeling, a vibration that settled deep in your bones. You couldn't escape it, no matter where you went. The lead scientist, Dr. Hart, tried to keep things under control. She gave speeches about perseverance, about the importance of the mission, but even she was starting to crack. Her hands trembled when she spoke, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there before. She didn't talk about the dreams, but I could tell she was having them too. Everyone was. It was around this time that the first body was found, one of the night shift workers, slumped in a corridor near the hangar. At first we thought it was a heart attack. He was older, and the stress of the past week had been taking its toll on all of us. But then we saw his face. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. They were wide open, staring straight ahead, but there was no life in them. Just this emptiness. His mouth was twisted in a silent scream, like he'd seen something so terrible that it had broken him. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no explanation. The medics didn't know what to make of it. They took him away, but the image of his face stayed with me. I started seeing it everywhere, in the reflections of the glass doors, in the shadows at the edges of my vision. I knew it wasn't real, but that didn't make it any easier. People started leaving after that. Not officially. There were no announcements, no goodbyes. They just stopped showing up. Their quarters would be empty, their workstations abandoned. Nobody talked about it, but we all noticed. The halls grew quieter, emptier. The echo of footsteps stretching farther than they should, and the dust kept spreading. I remember the moment I realized there was no way out. I was sitting in the common area, trying to focus on a report, when the power flickered. Not a blackout, just a brief surge that made the lights dim and the machinery stutter. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in that moment, I felt something. It was like the room shifted, not physically, everything was still in the same place, but the space itself felt wrong. Like I was standing in a photograph that had been distorted, stretched in ways it shouldn't have been, and in that moment, I knew. Whatever had come back with the probe, it wasn't content to stay in the hangar. It was here, with us, in the walls, in the air, in the very fabric of the facility. The fear had become suffocating, a constant weight pressing down on all of us. By now, half the staff were either gone or refusing to leave their quarters. Those of us who stayed kept to ourselves, moving through the halls with our heads down, avoiding eye contact like we might catch whatever it was if we looked at each other for too long. Nobody spoke about the probe anymore. Even the scientists who had once been so eager to study it seemed reluctant to go near the hangar. But we all knew it was still there, watching. The dust was everywhere now. It coated the walls, the floors, the equipment. You could see it shifting sometimes, like it was alive, like it was breathing. People stopped trying to clean it up. It didn't make a difference anyway. The more you disturbed it, the faster it seemed to spread. I stopped sleeping in my quarters after I woke up one night to find it drifting down from the ceiling like snow. I moved to an empty office on the far side of the facility, as far from the hangar as I could get. But it didn't help. The dust always found its way in. The dreams were getting worse too. They weren't just flashes anymore. They felt real, like I was actually there. In the dark, under those alien stars, with the shapes moving in the distance. Sometimes I could hear them, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a voice, but carried a sense of purpose, like they were calling to me. I woke up each time with the taste of metal in my mouth and the pulse pounding in my ears, and then there were the whispers. At first I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the stress, but they grew louder, more insistent. They didn't come from the air, though. That would have been easier to dismiss. No, the whispers came from inside my head. They weren't words, exactly, but they carried meaning. Promises, warnings. I didn't tell anyone about them. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. And even if they did, what could they do? It was Dr. Hart who finally broke the silence. She called a meeting, pulling together the few of us who were still functioning. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the podium. She didn't sugarcoat it. "We've made a mistake," she said, her eyes scanning the room like she was looking for something, anything that could help. "Whatever we brought back, it's not inert, it's intelligent, and it's spreading." The words hung in the air like a weight. We all knew it, of course. We'd felt it in the walls, in the air, in our very bones. But hearing her say it out loud made it real. Some of the team started asking questions, shouting over each other in a desperate attempt to make sense of it all. Dr. Hart didn't answer. She just stood there, staring down at the podium, her knuckles white against the metal. And then the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Someone fumbled for a flashlight, and the beam cut through the dark, shaky and uncertain. But it didn't help. The light didn't chase away the shadows. It seemed to make them deeper, more alive. And then I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the room, just outside the circle of light. At first I thought it was a person, one of the staff who'd gone missing. But as the flashlight beam swept closer, I realized it wasn't human. Not anymore. Its form was twisted, stretched, like it had been reshaped by something that didn't understand what a human was supposed to look like. Its eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. And then it moved. It didn't move like us. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, too fast and then too slow, like it was fighting against some invisible force just to stay upright. The sound it made was worse, a wet, slithering noise that didn't belong in this world. My body froze as the thing stepped closer, its misshapen shadow stretching across the walls. The flashlight beam flickered wildly as the person holding it started to shake. Someone screamed, a sharp, desperate sound that snapped me out of my paralysis. I don't even know who it was. All I knew was that I had to run. The others had the same idea, scattering in all directions, but the darkness swallowed them as quickly as they moved. I stumbled through the corridors, my heart hammering in my chest, the pulse from the probe now pounding in my skull. It felt like it was everywhere, driving me forward even as the air seemed to grow heavier with every step. I ended up in one of the storage rooms, slamming the door shut behind me and throwing myself against it as if that would stop whatever was out there. The room was pitch black except for the faint glow of an emergency light in the corner. My breathing was loud, ragged, and for a moment I thought I was safe. But then I heard it, a low, rasping sound, coming from somewhere inside the room. I didn't want to look. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, that I was alone, that whatever was out there hadn't followed me. But I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, my eyes straining against the dim light. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then I noticed the dust. It was gathering in the center of the room, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns. It was alive, and it was watching me. The rasping grew louder, and the dust began to take shape, rising from the floor like smoke solidifying into flesh. It didn't look like the thing I'd seen in the meeting room. This was something else, something worse. Its form was unstable, shifting and writhing as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. But its eyes, those were constant, deep, dark voids that seemed to pull at me, dragging me closer without ever moving. I pressed myself harder against the door, my hand fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The rasping turned into a sound that almost resembled laughter, a dry, hollow noise that seemed to echo inside my head. The dust creature tilted its head as if studying me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of insignificance, like I was an insect being observed by something vast and incomprehensible. The emergency light flickered, and for a moment the room was plunged into complete darkness. When it came back on, the thing was gone, but the dust was still there, swirling lazily in the air, waiting. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I threw myself at the door with all my strength, and this time it gave way. I ran without thinking, my only goal to get as far away from that room as possible. The halls were empty now, eerily quiet except for the faint hum of the failing power systems. I didn't know where everyone else had gone, and I didn't care. All I could think about was the hangar, the probe, and the awful truth that was starting to dawn on me. We hadn't just brought something back. We'd invited it in. It wasn't just the dust or the shadows or the things crawling out of the darkness. It was the facility itself. The walls, the air, the very ground beneath our feet. It was all infected, changing, and it wasn't stopping. I could feel it now, a creeping awareness that stretched far beyond the confines of this place. Whatever we had awakened, it was spreading, and it wouldn't stop until there was nothing left. By the time I made it to the control room, the facility felt like a tomb. The once bright corridors were shrouded in darkness, lit only by the occasional flicker of dying emergency lights. The pulse was deafening now, no longer a faint hum, but a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It vibrated through the walls, through the floor, through my skull. It was alive, and it was growing stronger. The control room was empty, the rows of monitors casting pale blue light over abandoned chairs and scattered papers. I locked the door behind me, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Whatever this thing was, it didn't need doors to find you. Still, the illusion of safety gave me a moment to think. Or at least, I tried to think. My thoughts felt slippery, disjointed, like they were being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. The pulse wasn't just a sound anymore. It was in my head. I scanned the monitors, looking for any sign of the others. Most of the cameras were down, static or darkness filling the screens, but a few still worked. I flipped through them, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would make sense of the chaos. That's when I saw the hangar. The probe was open now, its shell split wide like a jagged wound. The dust poured out in waves, flowing across the floor in unnatural patterns, spiraling upward in shapes that defied logic. And in the center of it all, something was emerging. It was vast, impossibly vast, far too large to fit within the confines of the hangar. Its form shifted and twisted, never settling into anything recognizable. Yet somehow, it felt familiar. Like I'd seen it before. In the dreams. The camera feed began to distort, the image warping and flickering as the thing grew. It wasn't just a physical presence, it was something deeper, something that resonated on a level beyond what we could perceive. I could feel it pressing against my mind, a cold, invasive force that seemed to peel back the layers of who I was, exposing everything, my fears, my memories, my soul. The lights in the control room began to dim, the pulse growing louder and louder until it felt like my skull was about to split open. I clutched at the console, trying to hold on to something, anything. But the force was too strong. It was pulling me in, dragging me toward the monitor, toward the thing in the hangar. And then the whispers started again. They were clearer now, more distinct. They weren't just sounds. They were voices. Thousands of them overlapping and merging into a single incomprehensible stream of meaning. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. They spoke of things I couldn't understand, of places and concepts that didn't exist in our reality. And yet, I felt a terrible familiarity, like I had always known them, but had forgotten until this moment. The door behind me rattled, and I turned just in time to see the shadow seep through the cracks. It wasn't a person, not anymore. It was one of the things, the twisted remains of what had once been human, now reshaped into something unrecognizable. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its void-like eyes fixed on mine. I backed away, my legs trembling, but there was nowhere to go. I turned back to the monitor, to the impossible creature in the hangar. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to look at it, to let it consume me. Maybe it was the whispers, or maybe it was something deeper, a part of me that had given up. The dust in the control room began to swirl, rising like a tide, and I knew I couldn't escape. The last thing I remember was the light. It wasn't bright, not in the way we understand light. It was dark, infinite, a light that consumed rather than illuminated. It filled the room, filled me until there was nothing left, no facility, no me, just the pulse, endless and eternal. And then silence.